poisoned by her husband for the inheritance money. A cowboy bound her wounds and gave her daylight. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not her, the horse. The smell of horse sweat and alkali dust and something else underneath it, something wrong, the way a creek smells wrong before you see what's died upstream. I was 3 miles out of Calhoun Flats, moving along the dry cut of the Perdita Wash, headed nowhere in particular at a pace that said the same. My name is Clem Darnell. I was 61 years old that October. I had been riding alone for longer than I care to count out loud. The horse, my horse, a gray quarter horse named Rook, he stopped. Just planted his feet and wouldn't go. I don't fight a horse when he does that. The horse usually knows something. I pulled up and sat quiet and listened, whined off the flats. A red-tailed hawk circling lazy about 200 feet up. The low groan of the wash cutting through hardpan, nothing else. Then I saw the other horse. Downstream of me maybe 60 yards, standing in the shade of a cutbank with its reins dragging. A bay mare, good conformation, well shod, the kind of horse that belongs to money. She was lathered up bad and her head was down and she kept shifting her front feet like she'd been standing too long in one place. There was a shape on the ground beside her. I rode down. The shape was a woman. She was lying on her side in the dirt of the wash bottom, one hand flat against the ground like she'd tried to push herself up and hadn't made it. She was dressed for travel, a good gray coat, decent boots, her hair pulled back and mostly still pinned. The kind of woman you'd see stepping off a stage coach in front of the hotel, not lying in a dry creek bed 40 miles from anything. I got down off Rook and crouched beside her. She was breathing, shallow and fast, but breathing. Her face was gray-white, not sunburn, not cold, something else. I put my hand to her throat and her pulse was there but faint and uneven like a clock running down. Her lips had a faint blue tint at the corners. I've seen men with that color after a hard snake bite, and I've seen it once on a man whose partner put something in his food. Both times I knew it wasn't good. She opened her eyes. They were brown, dark brown, like creek water in shade. She looked at me, and I could see she was trying to figure out if I was something to be afraid of. I said, "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Clem. I'm going to get you up." She said something I couldn't hear. I leaned down closer. She said, "Don't take me back." That was all I needed to know. I got her up off the ground, which was harder than it sounds. She couldn't hold herself. She was a tall woman, lean but solid, and she'd gone boneless the way people do when they're that sick, no muscle tone, just weight. I got her up against my chest and walked her to Rook and got her into the saddle, which took 3 tries and some language I won't repeat. Once she was up there, she grabbed the saddle horn and held it with both hands, and I gave her credit for that. Even half gone, she was trying. I led her horse with my left hand and held Rook's rein with my right, and we walked back up the wash the way I'd come. Not back toward Calhoun Flats. The other direction. East, toward the Garnet Claim, a 2-room stone house I'd been running cattle off of since spring for a man named Holloway who'd gone to Santa Fe on business and left me as the only soul within 12 miles. Good. That was what this needed, distance. She rode with her head down and her hands white on the saddle horn, and she didn't say another word for 3 miles. I watched her the whole way. Once her shoulders started shaking and I thought she'd go over, but she held. Twice she retched and got nothing up. I kept us walking slow. Rook was steady. He always was. Good horse. When we got to the Garnet house, she was barely conscious. I got her down from Rook and got her inside and onto the cot in the back room. I got her boots off and got the coat off and covered her with 2 blankets. Her hands were like cold iron. I built up the stove. The one good thing about a stone house is it holds heat. And I put water on and I sat down on the floor beside the cot and I looked at her. She was maybe 40 years old, maybe a hair less. She had good bones in her face, a strong jaw, and she'd been handsome once and probably still was when she wasn't the color of old ash. There were dark smudges under her eyes that weren't from the road. The kind of dark that comes from weeks of not sleeping or from the body fighting something it can't quite beat. Her hands, where I'd held them, were trembling even now that she was covered. I knew enough about poison to know I didn't know enough. What I knew, keep her warm, keep her still, get water into her when I could, and wait. Some things work through, some things don't. All I could do was be there while it decided. She woke up 2 hours later. Not strong waking, not sitting up and asking where she was. Just opened her eyes and turned her head and found me sitting in the chair I'd dragged over from the table. I had a cup of broth, dried beef, hot water, a little salt, and I held it out and she looked at it and then at me. I said, "Small sips, don't rush it." She took the cup in both hands. She had to hold it with both hands. That bothered me more than I let on. She drank. She kept it down. I said, "What's your name?" She said, "Vera Ashby." I said, "Where were you headed, Vera?" She looked at the wall for a second. "Away, then, I don't know yet, just away." I said, "All right." She looked at me then, really looked. Not the scared assessment from the wash, not trying to figure out what I wanted. Just looking like she was trying to read something written small. She said, "You haven't asked me anything about it." I said, "You'll tell me when you want to." She went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. She drank the rest of the broth and gave me back the cup and closed her eyes and slept. She slept most of the next 2 days. I slept in the main room, kept the stove fed, brought her water and broth every few hours. The trembling came and went. Once in the night she had a bad spell, shaking hard enough that the cot moved, making sounds like someone with a high fever, and I sat beside her and put my hand flat on her back between the shoulder blades and held it there, steady. Not words. Just the weight of a hand saying, "I'm here, you're not alone, ride it out." It passed. On the third morning she woke up with more color in her face and more focus in her eyes, and she sat up on her own and asked me if I had coffee. I said, "I do." She said, "I'd appreciate some." I made coffee. She sat on the edge of the cot with the blanket around her shoulders and held the tin cup the same way she'd held the broth cup, 2 hands, careful, but the shaking was less. She looked out the small window at the front wall of the house. Just the flats, yellowed grass, a line of low hills in the distance. October sky, high and pale. She said, "My husband's name is Gerald Ashby. He has a ranch southeast of Dana, the Barre, about 4,000 acres. He married me 7 years ago for my father's estate." She said it flat, no drama in it. Just the facts, the way a man speaks about a business gone bad. I waited. She said, "My father left everything to me directly. Gerald has been managing the property under my authority, but the principal remains mine as long as I'm alive. If I die, it reverts to him by the marriage contract." She turned the cup in her hands. "I've been sick for 4 months. The doctor in Dana said it was a wasting illness. He believed it because Gerald told him so, and Gerald is a man of standing in that town." She paused. "About 3 weeks ago, one of the kitchen girls, she's 15, a Mexican girl, Paloma, she came to me at night when Gerald was in town. She'd seen him. She showed me the little glass bottle and the flour canister. I didn't believe it. I believed it for about 2 days, and then I believed it." She looked at me. I said, "How much time between when you stopped taking it and when you ran?" She said, "A week." That was something. A week was enough time for some things to start clearing. Not all things, but some. I said, "Where's the girl now?" Vera looked down at the cup. "He let her go the same day I left, paid her off. She has family in Sonora. She'll be all right." A breath. "I took 2 horses. I knew if I took only one he'd have me inside of a day. He'd say the horse went lame and I borrowed another. 2 horses looks like flight. He'll come looking." I said, "Yes." She looked up. "I'm putting you in trouble." I said, "That's my business to decide." She looked at me a moment longer. Then she went back to her coffee. On the 4th day she was up and moving around the house on her own. Slow, careful, one hand trailing the wall when she crossed the room, but upright under her own power. That was something. I watched her move, and I could see the woman she was under the sickness. There was nothing soft or fluttering about her. When she reached for something, she reached sure. When she spoke, she chose her words and then said them clean. She'd had a hard life for a woman with money, which is a particular kind of hard. I rode out that morning to check the cattle. I had about 30 head on the north pasture, Holloway's cows, and I'd been neglecting them, and I came back in the late afternoon, and she'd swept the floor and found the salt pork in the dry goods box and had something going on the stove. She looked up when I came in, no apology for having made herself at home in another man's kitchen, just a look that said, "You've been doing for me, now I'm doing something too." I washed up and sat down. The food was good, better than mine. We ate without talking much, which suited us both, I think. After, she said, "Is there any way to know if he's coming?" I said, "Not for certain, but the Garnet claim isn't on any road he'd know. The man who owns this place, Holloway, he doesn't advertise it. I picked it partly for that reason." She said, "You picked it for me." I said, "I had to take you somewhere." She looked at me, said nothing for a moment. Then, "My father used to say that a man who does a thing without needing to be thanked for it is worth more than all the men who need the thanking." She paused. He was talking about foremen and ranch hands, mostly, but I think about it sometimes in other ways. I didn't say anything to that. But I thought about it later, washing up the supper dishes in the dark outside the door, cold water from the pump. I thought about it more than I should have. Gerald Ashby came on the 7th day. I didn't know it was him when I first saw the dust. 2 riders coming from the southwest, moving at a canter, not the leisurely pace of men out looking at country, not the hard driving of men with a purpose they're eager to show. Something in between, purposeful but careful about it. I went inside. Vera was sitting at the table doing something with a needle and thread. One of my shirts had a torn pocket, and she'd found it in the pile by the washstand without being asked. She looked up and read my face. I said, 2 men coming from the southwest. She set down the shirt and the needle and sat very still. How far? 10 minutes. She said, is there a back way out? I said, there is, but I'm not taking it. She looked at me. I said, this is Holloway's land. I'm the man responsible for it. Those men have no right to come onto it and take anything off it. That includes you. She held my eyes for a second. Then she said, all right. I got my rifle from the corner. A Winchester 76.4575, the rifle I'd been carrying since I was 30 years old and see no reason to change. I checked it out of habit even though I knew it was loaded. 13 in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. I went outside and sat down on the stone step in front of the door, rifle across my knees, and waited. They came into the yard at a walk. 2 men, like I said. The one on the right was big, thick through the chest, wearing a good coat and a good hat, the kind of man who wants you to know he has money without him having to say it. That was Gerald Ashby, and I knew it before he spoke. The other one was younger, harder looking, a hired man. Ashby pulled up about 30 feet out and looked at me the way men like him look at men like me, taking his time about it, making sure I understood I was being sized up. He said, I'm looking for my wife. Her name is Vera Ashby. She's been ill and she wandered off from our property 4 or 5 days ago. I've been tracking the horse. I said, I don't know any Vera Ashby. He said, 2 horses came through here. The sign is plain. I said, I had a loose horse come in from the flats, turned it loose again when it seemed fit. He looked at me, he said, I'd like to look inside. I said, you wouldn't. He held for a moment. The hired man was looking at my rifle. Good. I wanted him looking at my rifle. Ashby said, Mister, you don't know what you're getting into. I said, I might surprise you. He let out a long breath through his nose. He said, she's not well, she needs doctoring. Whatever she told you, she's not in her right mind. The illness, it affects the thinking. I said, that's so. He said, I just want my wife back, that's all. I looked at him a while. He had a good face for lying, open, reasonable, a little sad around the eyes. The kind of face that had worked on people for years. I thought about the glass bottle in the flour canister. I thought about a 15-year-old Mexican girl going to a sick woman in the night because it was the right thing to do. I said, you came a long way for nothing, Mr. Ashby. There's no one here but me and the cattle. I'd suggest you turn around. He looked at me, his face shifted. The reasonable sadness went away, and what was underneath it was something else, cold, calculating, the real machinery of the man. He said, you have any idea what I can do to a man like you? I said, tell me. He didn't. Men like that don't when you ask them plain. He said, I'll be back with the law. I said, you do that. The territorial marshal's office is in Prescott. You ride hard, you can be there in 2 days. I'll be here. He looked at me one more time. Then he turned his horse and he and his man rode back the way they'd come. I sat on the stone step and watched the dust until it was gone. Then I sat there a while longer, just breathing. Vera came to the door behind me. I hadn't heard her move. She said, he'll come back. I said, yes. She said, with more men. I said, probably. She came out and stood beside me and looked at the place where the dust had been. The sky was going orange and red in the west, that October light that comes in low and flat and makes everything look like it's made of copper. She said, Clem. I said, yeah. She said, I need to get word to a lawyer. There's a man in Tucson, Harlan Brook, who knew my father. If I can get him a letter, he can move to protect the estate and me both. Gerald can't fight a lawyer in Tucson with my interests on record. I thought about it. I said, Holloway's due back from Santa Fe in about 2 weeks. He'll have been through Tucson on the way back. She said, that's too long. I said, I know, but I've got a man I trust, a Navajo man who rides for the Bar 7 about 15 miles north. He'd carry a letter for me. He knows the country and he moves fast and quiet. She thought about it, then she said, yes, that'll do. We went back inside. I rode to the Bar 7 the next morning early, before good light, and I was back by noon. Vera had written the letter the night before, 2 pages, tight and clear, laying out exactly what had been done and exactly what she needed. I'd read it when she handed it to me. She wrote the way she spoke, no wasted words, nothing soft about it, just the truth laid out like lumber, plank by plank. The Navajo man was called Hostine by the cowboys at the Bar 7, though that was just the Navajo word for Mr. and not his real name. He was about 50, quiet as a standing rock, and he took the letter from me and put it inside his shirt and looked at me with no expression at all and said, Tucson. I said 4 days. He nodded and rode south. When I got back to the Garnet house, Vera was in the small pasture behind the house with her bay mare, currying her down. The mare had come a long way without proper tending, and Vera was working through a winter coat's worth of tangles, slow and patient. She didn't stop when she heard me come around the corner of the house. She just said, without looking up, how long before we know? I said 10 days if everything goes right. She said, and if Ashby comes back before then? I said, then we deal with Ashby. She kept working. The mare leaned into the currying. A horse that leans into the brush has had good handling. That said something about this woman even without her saying it. She said, you've been running cattle out here alone. I said, since May. She said, before that? I told her. Not much to tell, 40 years of ranch work across 3 territories, a few years of trail driving before the drive stopped. Some time I spent up in the Mogollon country running a hunting camp for a rich man from back east who decided one winter that the frontier was romantic. It wasn't romantic. It was just cold, and I was the one who kept it from being dangerous, which the rich man never fully appreciated but paid for well enough. She said, did you ever have a place of your own? I said, once, 30 acres on the Verd River. I sold it in '84 when I needed the money. She said, what for? I said, my brother was in debt, bad debt, the kind that gets a man hurt. She stopped brushing and looked at me. I hadn't planned to say that. It came out on its own. She said, did it work? I said, it worked for 2 years. Then he got back in debt again, different men, same amount. I paused. He died in '87, horse rolled on him. I stopped. So the 30 acres went for nothing. She looked at me a moment longer than was comfortable. Not pitying, she didn't have that kind of look in her. More like she was holding the weight of what I'd said and not dropping it. She said, I'm sorry, Clem. I said, it was a long time ago. She turned back to the mare. She said, that kind of loyalty doesn't grow on trees. I didn't answer, but I turned that over for a long time, the way you turn a stone in your hand that has an unexpected heft to it. Ashby didn't come back that week, or the next. On the 9th day, a boy came up the road from the south, couldn't have been more than 16, riding a rangy pinto, and he had a letter in his hat for a Clem Darnell at the Garnet claim. I gave him 50 cents and a piece of jerked beef and sent him back. The letter was from Harlan Brook in Tucson. 3 pages. Legal language I only half understood, but the substance was clear enough. Brook had filed papers with the territorial court establishing Vera's legal status and her control over her own estate. A writ of protection had been applied for. Brook requested Vera come to Tucson at her earliest safe opportunity to appear before the court. But in the meantime, the filing itself would make any action by Gerald Ashby against her property legally contestable. I brought the letter to Vera. She was sitting at the table reading a dog-eared copy of something Holloway had left on the shelf. I never did find out what it was. She took the letter and read it through twice. When she set it down, her hands were steady. She said, he can't touch the estate now. Not without a fight he can't win in open court. I said, what does that do to him? She said, it takes away his reason. She was quiet a moment. Gerald is a practical man. He didn't marry me for love. He won't chase me across the territory for love either. If the money is protected, coming after me is just risk with no reward. I said, men don't always follow the logic they started with. She said, no. but Gerald is more afraid of embarrassment than he is of anything else. A public court fight with me as the living plaintiff, showing what he did, that terrifies him more than losing the estate. She folded the letter. He'll look for a quiet way out. I thought about that. I thought about the reasonable sadness on his face in the yard. I said, what does a quiet way out look like for him? She said, divorce, quietly, probably with some settlement that lets him claim he was the aggrieved party. A pause. I'd give him whatever he asks, I just want to be gone from it. I said, and then what? She looked up from the letter. I said, after the court, after the settlement, what do you do? She was quiet a long moment. She looked around the small room, the bare stone walls, the stove, the window with the flats outside going brown and gold in the November light that was settling in now over the plateau. She said, I have the estate, a good-sized property northeast of Flagstaff. My father built the house there when I was 12. I haven't been back since the year before I married Gerald. She paused. I suppose I go back. I said, alone. It wasn't a question, not exactly. More like saying it out loud to hear how it sat. She looked at me. There was something in her face that I hadn't seen before, careful, almost hesitant, which was not a quality she usually showed. She said, that depends. I said, on what? She said, on whether I'm asking too much. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind off the flats moved through the dry grass with a sound like something sighing. I sat across the table from this woman who had been dying in a dry wash 10 days ago and who had walked back from it one careful step at a time. And I thought about 40 years of writing for other men's herds and selling my 30 acres for a brother who couldn't be saved. And I thought about what it felt like to have somewhere to be in the morning other than just away. I said, you're not asking too much. She held my eyes. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, just laid it there, palm down, steady. Her hand was warm now, not cold iron anymore. Warm. She didn't say anything, neither did I. We sat like that for a long while, the stove going, the wind outside, the last light coming through the window and lying across the table between us. We left for Tucson on the 14th day. Holloway came back from Santa Fe on day 12, 2 days earlier than I'd expected, and stood in the yard of his own house and looked at the two of us and the situation with an expression of careful neutrality that I respected him for. I told him what had happened, plain and short. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, the cattle look good, and went inside to make coffee. That was Holloway. I'd known him for 6 years. He let us stay until we were ready to ride, which took 2 more days. Vera needed more strength for the road, and I needed to make sure she had it. I rode with her to Tucson, a 3-day trip across open country I knew well. We traveled easy, not pushing hard, stopping early enough to make a decent camp, eating real food because I'd provisioned properly. The second night out, she sat across the fire from me and asked me about the Mogollon country, what it looked like in spring. I told her. She listened with her hands around her cup and her eyes on the fire, and when I was done, she said, I've never been up there. I said, I'll take you sometime. She looked up at me over the fire. Something passed across her face, not surprise exactly, more like something quietly settled. She said, yes. We got to Tucson on the evening of the 3rd day. Brooke met us at his office, a small man, neat as a pin, who shook Vera's hand and looked at her with the particular relief of a man who had been genuinely worried. He looked at me and then at her and back at me, and he said, I see you had help. Vera said, the best kind. The legal business took 3 days. Vera appeared before the territorial court. Brooke filed the last of his papers. There was a brief and surprisingly quiet communication from Ashby's own lawyer in Dana. He wanted a settlement, just as Vera had predicted. No court fight. No public airing. A negotiated separation of the estate, which Brooke handled so thoroughly in Vera's favor that even I could follow it. It was done in 10 days total. I don't know what I expected it to feel like. It felt less like a door closing than like a window opening onto a room I hadn't known was there. I'll tell you the moment I go back to when I think about that time. Not the standoff in the yard, not the letter from Brooke, not even the night at the table with her hand over mine, though I think about that plenty. It was the day before we left Tucson. Vera had spent the morning with Brooke wrapping up the last of the legal work, and I'd spent it at the livery getting Rook properly rishad and buying supplies for the road. We met at noon at a small restaurant near the courthouse, the kind of place with oilcloth on the tables and decent food, And when I came in, she was already seated, and she looked up when I came through the door, and she smiled. Not a polite smile. Not the careful, guarded expression she'd worn for the first week at the Garnet house. A real smile, the kind that starts in the eyes and gets to the mouth late. It was the smile of a woman who had come back from a long way under and found something on the other side of it worth smiling at. And she was looking at me when she did it. I sat down across from her. The waiter brought coffee. She looked at me and she said, "Brooke says everything is finalized." I said, "Good." She said, "I want to go home, Clem. I want to go back to the house in Flagstaff." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't want to go alone." I looked at her. She wasn't asking a small thing, and we both knew it. She was asking with her eyes clear and her back straight and no hedge in her voice. This was not a woman who asked small things. I said, "I'm not a man who fits in a house easy. I'm better in a barn. I don't sleep past 4 in the morning. I'll track mud in." She said, "Clem." I stopped. She said, "I didn't ask you to fit in a house. I asked you to come home." That's the moment, right there. I've turned it over so many times in the years since that it has a different weight now than it did, heavier in some ways, lighter in others. A woman who had been used and half killed and who had everything she needed to go rebuild her life alone, and she sat across a table with a coffee cup and looked at me with those dark eyes and said, "Come home." Like home was wherever I was going to be. I said, "All right." We rode north out of Tucson on a cool, clear morning, the kind where the air has a bite to it that promises winter without quite delivering it yet. Vera's bay mare was well rested and moving good. Rook was fresh from the livery. We had 6 days of provisions and an easy pace and no one behind us. I remember crossing the high ground east of the Santa Catalinas. The saguaro up there are enormous, 40, 50 feet high, some of them, and in the morning light they cast long shadows like men standing watch. We rode through them side by side and didn't speak for a long while, the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. She said eventually, "Tell me about the Verd property." "The 30 acres. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I want to know what you wanted." I thought about it. I hadn't talked about that land in years. I said it was good bottomland. River ran on 2 sides. There was a stand of cottonwoods on the north end, maybe 20 trees, and in the fall they went yellow all at once. You could see them from half a mile off. I was going to run 40 head and have a garden and a small orchard. Apples. I planted 8 trees before I sold. She said, "What happened to them?" I said, "I don't know. The man I sold to, I heard he drowned 2 years later in a flood. What happened to the property after that, I never found out." She was quiet, then she said, "There's a creek on the north side of my father's property. It runs most of the year. The soil in the bottom is good. I haven't done anything with it." I said nothing. She said, "I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying." I said, "I hear you." She looked at me sideways, and she had that expression that was not quite smiling but that showed something alive in it, and she said, "Good." We rode on. The saguaros thinned and gave way to grassland, and the sky opened up the way it does on the plateau, enormous, pale blue going deeper as the morning came on, with white clouds building in the west that had the look of weather coming but not today. I've worked for other men my whole life, done what needed doing when it needed doing, for wages that covered what I needed and not much more. I am not a man who complains about that. It was honest work and I did it honestly and I have never once been ashamed of it. But I'll tell you, riding north through that country on that morning with a woman beside me who had looked at me across a restaurant table and called it coming home, that was a different thing than I'd had before. It had a different weight to it, a good weight, the kind of weight you want. We got to the property outside Flagstaff on the afternoon of the 6th day. The house was empty but sound, a white frame house, 2 stories with a long porch facing south. The porch boards were soft in places and the paint was going and the yard was gone to grass and scrub, but the bones were right. Good chimney, good roof line, good deep well in the yard. The kind of house built by a man who built to last. Vera stood in the front yard and looked at it for a long time. I stayed back and let her have that. She said finally without turning around, "My father built it in 1873, the summer I was 12. I watched him every day that summer, he and 4 other men." She paused. "I haven't been here in 9 years. I said, "It's still good." She said, "Yes," a breath. "It needs work." I said, "I can see that." She turned and looked at me. The late afternoon sun was behind her, and it lit her up, that October light again, copper warm, the kind that makes everything look exactly as it should be. She said, "Can you stay and help me put it right?" I said, "I can do that." She walked back across the yard to where I was standing. She stopped about 2 feet from me and looked up. She was tall but not so tall as me, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at me across that restaurant table in Tucson. Direct. No hedge. Eyes that had seen what men could be at their worst and were choosing, plainly and on purpose, to look at something better. She put her hand against my chest, just rested it there over my coat, over my heart. She said, "I know what kind of man you are, Clem Darnell. I knew it in the wash when I looked up at you." I said, "What kind is that?" She said, "The kind that does what's right because it's right, not because anyone's watching." She paused. "There are not so many of them as people think." I put my hand over hers where it rested on my chest. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would have added to it. We stood like that in the front yard of her father's house in the afternoon light, with the porch needing repair behind her, and winter coming off the high peaks to the north and work to be done in the morning, and for a good many mornings after that. I'm still here. That was 11 years ago. The porch boards got replaced that first winter, one plank at a time, working in the cold. The orchard is 8 trees, Vera's idea, though I was the one who remembered the Verd property and said as much. Apples, 2 varieties. They gave fruit for the first time 3 years in. I put in 40 head the second spring and built the pasture, fencing myself, post by post, using cedar from the north end of the property where the creek runs. Gerald Ashby remarried, I heard. Some woman in Phoenix, no great estate involved. I heard it second-hand and then not at all, which is the right amount to hear about a man like that. Vera runs the property with a clarity and steadiness that I have not seen in many men, let alone women. She handles the accounts herself, deals with the buyers herself, argues with the bank herself, wins. I handle the cattle and the water and the fencing and the things that need handling, and in the evening we sit on the rebuilt porch and watch the light go off the high peaks and drink whatever's available, coffee usually, sometimes not. People in town know us. They know what we are to each other, which is everything, though we keep the particulars of that to ourselves. What they know is that Clem Darnell is the man on the Trent property, and that you don't come at Vera Trent Ashby sideways, because her man will know it before you're off the road. That's fine by me, more than fine. She came out on the porch this last week, the one just behind me, and she sat down in her chair and she looked at the light on the mountains the same way she looked at everything. Direct, clear-eyed, no performance in it. And she said out of nowhere, "I think about that wash sometimes." I said, "The Perdita." She said, "Yes, what would have happened if you'd been a mile further east?" I said, "Rook stopped." She said, "Rook." I said, "He smelled something wrong. He always knows." She was quiet. Then she said, "I'm glad for that horse." I said, "Me too." She looked at me. That look, I have had it every day for 11 years, and it has not changed, not the weight of it, not the direction of it. A good woman looking at a man she chose to look at and seeing what she looked for. The light was going off the peaks. The apples were in. The cattle were settled. It was November, same as it was when we rode north out of Tucson, and the air had the same bite to it, promising winter without delivering it quite yet. I am 62 years old. I have not been soft a day in my life, and I don't intend to start. But I know what I have, and I know what it is, and I know that the man sitting on this porch in the evening with a good woman beside him is not the same man who was riding along the Perdita Wash with no particular place to go. That man found somewhere to be. He's still there,